Hi, this is James Valvis, who will be bequeathing his body and soul to Edgar Allan Poe for the next few minutes so that he can talk a little more about diversity. And what I want to talk about is here in his final talk about diversity is the political ramifications of diversity. So far, we've talked about how diversity has a positive and a negative roads that it can go down. And the positive side is where the most qualified people are given their positions based upon their best attributes and their character and their competence. And the negative side is where immutable characteristics are wedged into places they don't belong just to throw in some kind of forced diversity that has nothing to do with competence. And it leads to a dwindling of competence across the board and often causes great suffering. In the second part, we talked about the ramifications of that within the culture and to some degree what it means, why we have this diversity, what's the left's argument for diversity, that competence itself is a kind of privilege, that it's the patriarchy itself. They actually argue, in what I figure is a bigoted or a racist or a sexist way, that competence, especially since they believe it's heavily tilted toward white males, is somehow itself bigoted. In other words, if a surgeon is better at being a surgeon, he's better at being a surgeon because he's been given all kinds of privileges and is, from his race and his sex. Of course, the idea, you question that immediately and say, that may be true, but nevertheless, you don't want an incompetent surgeon, regardless of how he got that competency. Now, I don't think it's true. I think that competence bubbles up from culture. And so two of the things I want to talk about here is how the political ramifications of diversity and how culture undermines the idea of competence. Now, again, we have to explain that competence is vital for the functioning of society. It's vital for the functioning of any particular part of society. Now, my field happens to be literature. I'm Edgar Allan Poe and James Valvis, and I have a wide array of experience within this realm. And what I've seen over the course of my time in the literary field is a great dwindling of talent and competence within the field. And there are still many people who can write a very good poem, but there are many people who succeed wildly who are not good at all, who are barely literate for that matter, let alone competent at the field. And the reason they succeed has nothing to do with the fact that they are good at what they do. It has to do with the fact that they are saying things that people want to hear, and or they check off certain boxes within the paradigm. And again, since I work in a field where nobody's life is at stake, if somebody publishes a poem that is inferior to a poem that's superior, nevertheless, that's an injustice. And all injustice, in the end, ends up being tyrannical and ends up being problematic. And a part of that problem is politically. Politically, it becomes a problem. We are seeing extreme divisions within the differences between how white men vote and think and how everybody else thinks, specifically women, and specifically minority women, and then on top of that, to some degree, lesser degrees, minority men, white women, and so on. And the reason these divisions are happening is because the whole diversity idea is that it's a zero-sum game, and we have to take away from the competent and give to the less competent based on immutable characteristics. Now, if you see this as an injustice, then it's not something that's sustainable for a long period of time. Ultimately, people who are being cheated of their proper due are going to rebel against that. And they're going to rebel against it first in peaceful ways, if they can do that, and then they're going to become increasingly more agitated, and then they're going to become violent. So we've already seen some of this. We've seen some of the increase of white nationalism. We've seen an increase in male anger toward females in like the MGTOW movement and the incel movement, and other people who are saying that we're not being treated fairly. And when you have these diversity cults that are pushing against any kind of competence, it's not racial animus that's really driving this, and it's not gender animus that's driving this. It's power dynamics. That's what you have to understand. The feminists who are doing these things are not looking after women. If they cared about women, they'd be going over to Africa and caring for those women who have it really bad, or the Middle East, or to the Far East, or any place else, Mexico for that matter, any place else where women are truly mistreated. But they don't do that. They go after, they say things like, oh, the women, there are not enough women in Fortune 500 companies as CEOs. Well, who gives a shit? You're talking about 1% of 1% of 1% there. You're talking about the very smallest amount of power people that it just doesn't matter to most people whether there's a female running Chevrolet or running PepsiCo. Who cares? That's not going to affect most women's lives. It doesn't matter. But what you're seeing is across the board is that these women who are mostly powerful women who have white women in America are the most privileged group in the world. That is my firm belief. They are the most privileged group in the world. There is nobody even close to them, because no other group has as much money, influence, and power as them, and yet can claim victimhood. And they do this repeatedly, especially in my field, the literary field, well, and probably in other fields as well. But in my field, they are always complaining about how they're not getting their fair share. And yet they're massively outperforming men in just about every field. In just about every way, they're massively outperforming men. And there are only a few men holding up the dam that's bursting on them. And it doesn't matter how much they take over a certain magazine or field or university department. They just ignore that. If it's 90% female at the University of Princeton, their creative writing program, they'd ignore that, and they talk about the 60% male that is at the University of Michigan. They do this again and again. They go from place to place to place. You take a magazine like Prairie Schooner that's running like something like 70 to 80% female authors, and they brag about this. They brag about it all the time. They say, look at how enlightened we are. We're running all these minorities and females. And the whole idea is, you know, that's a good thing. And they'll talk about how somebody else, a lot of white men who are busting their butts in the literary field to try to get ahead, often to a greater degree than the females that are being promoted in this way, are not getting their fair due. That kind of injustice won't hold forever. Ultimately, people will find a way around that. I'm not saying that there's going to be some revolution because somebody's poem isn't going to be published. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that you will see a collapse within the field. The field will collapse as people say, okay, you won't let us have our proper amount of success, then we will go create a new dynamic, a new thing. And what is that new thing? For instance, one example of it, Donald Trump. Now, for a long time, white people, especially uneducated white, when I say uneducated, I don't mean that these are stupid people. I mean, they lack a college degree for whatever reason. I don't have a college degree because I was poor and had to go in the army just to survive. It wasn't that I wasn't smart enough to get a college degree. It was just that I was poor. So a lot of these people are coming from disadvantaged situations, or they're just they're not inclined to do that. This is something that the left doesn't understand. There are some people who like climbing under the hood of a car and working with their hands. My dad was like that. I know people like that. I grew up with people like that. They don't want to sit in a cubicle. When Obama would say something like, oh, these people need to go to community college and learn how to become data input people. They don't want to be data input people. You don't understand that. They want to put together widgets. That's what they like to do. I couldn't understand it. When I worked in a factory, there were people there who loved working in the factory, the grinder chipper factory. I thought it was a living hell. I thought it was a modern medieval torture chamber. But they loved it. They thought it was great. They thought it was the bomb to be doing this kind of work. There are people who enjoy that kind of work, and they don't want to go back to a community college or go to a community college and get the jobs of tomorrow. They don't want the jobs of tomorrow. They're not built that way. They don't think that way. And this is why you have these elites on the coastal places. And a lot of the times they say, well, I come from Iowa. No, you don't really come from Iowa. Your mentality was always New York City. It was always Bristol, Connecticut. It was always Los Angeles. Your mentality was never Des Moines, Iowa. And then there are certain people who are in Jersey City, their mentality is Des Moines, Iowa. And they usually run to Alabama or something first chance they get. And so you have these people who move and stuff, and they say, well, but they don't understand these people. They don't get it. They don't understand that they don't want to have those kinds of jobs. And they look down on those people. And they think, you're just lazy. You don't want to go get a college degree because you're lazy. No, it's not that they're lazy. They're disinclined. They don't want to do that. They don't want your job. They don't want to be a sound production engineer at some news studio. It's just not what they want to do. They want to farm. They want to be mechanics. They want to put together widgets. They like that. They're into manufacturing. They like driving a tractor. They like being outside. They like the sun in their hair. And they're not bad people for that. We used to really value people like that. They were much more necessary. Now a lot of their jobs have been taken over by robotics, and it's allowed these effete morons to look down on people who aren't like them and who are not inclined to be like them. But we used to have a greater respect for those people. And we will, yet again, in the future, have a greater respect for them. Because this kind of economy cannot go on forever. This information economy, it's a kind of a bubble. I mean, really, when you think about it, there isn't any there an ad on Facebook is what? It's not a product. It's not a thing. This talk itself is not a product. It's more of a product than than a Facebook ad, but it's not really a product. You don't need it to live. You don't need it to get by in life. It's not even a book. It's not even something you can hold. And so this kind of information economy, to some degree, is a bubble. You're producing things that are not necessarily real. And at some point, somebody needs to build the car so you can get from point A to point B. That's real. Okay. So the political, like I said, one of the ramifications of this has been Donald Trump. Donald Trump that's the political cost of ignoring people and of looking down on people and of always putting them last, or saying that they're somehow privileged when a lot of the times they're not, and they're struggling and they're having a hard time getting through, and they're not advancing in the way they used to advance. And you're seeing great success for your particular field, no matter what it is. You're a lawyer, or you're a college professor, or maybe you think, oh my God, college professor, I'm not doing as well as I am. I'm only making $60,000 a year. Well, you know what? $60,000 a year is pretty good for having summers off and every holiday off, and so you got to bring papers home sometimes, and the guy crawling under the hood and getting his hands dirty all the time and working 10, 12 hours a day, and he's making $40,000 a year, and he's hearing you complain about grading papers. You know what he thinks? He thinks I'm voting for Donald Trump. That's what he thinks. He thinks you don't care about me at all. You don't understand me at all. And I don't feel your plight, especially since you have one kid and I have three. One designer kid, and he's spoiled with everything, and my three kids maybe might get to college, or maybe they might have their places taken by somebody who gets a quota. Ultimately, you cannot have this kind of injustice without building up political movements that go contrary to the things that you want done. Now, I am no longer a leftist, but if I was still a leftist, I would say the very things that the left cares about. You want to keep abortion legal? I hope you don't. But if you want to keep abortion legal, you cannot alienate 65 to 75% of white men. You can't do it, because they're going to vote against you, and maybe they are voting for their economics, because you've completely given up their jobs and you've told them to go to community college. But it's going to have ramifications in the culture as well. All the other stuff that you care about is going to be taken away as well. You're going to lose the Supreme Court for a generation. You're going to lose, ballot measures that you cared about. You're going to lose, they're going to build a wall and all the rest of it. Because ultimately, I've said this a million times to a million people, and it doesn't seem like anyone ever listens to me. Nobody ever listens to me anyway. It's one of those things. I call myself a modern Cassandra. I say the same thing over and over again. I'm almost always right, but nobody ever listens. But the thing I say is, if you don't want to have a Hitler, don't make the conditions for Hitler happen. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that Donald Trump is Hitler, by the way. Anybody who thinks Donald Trump is Hitler, stop this, pause this tape right now, smack yourself a few times to get a hold of yourself, and then turn it back on again, because you really need to get a grip. All right? But if you don't want the conditions for stronger border security, if you don't want to put the conditions in which children are being separated from their parents at the border, then don't make the conditions for that. Don't make it so that we have open borders, and we have all kinds of people coming into the country, and they could be terrorists, and we know that some people are committing crimes, and some people, and all this bad stuff is happening, and you don't want to do any kind of border enforcement because it might cost you a Democratic vote in California that's voting 90% Democrat at this point. If you don't want that, then don't make the conditions for that happen. You need to have a more moderate kind of view of the world. You need to say, well, I'm not going to get everything that I want, but in not getting everything that I want, I can avoid the things I really don't want. I can avoid the things that are going to turn things horrible. And I'm for that. I don't think that right now I am on the right, but I've been forced on the right. I've been forced on the right by the left. The left has become so hysterical and so out of control politically that I have been left no choice but to go to the right. And part of it is because I see, even in my own field, where I'm just being squeezed out. If it's not by reading fees, where they're just absolutely recklessly taking advantage of writers, it's that they are, advantaging people over me everywhere I turn. And I'm a good writer, but I'm not that good. I'm not good enough to overcome both incredibly talented people and them getting affirmative action for their writing. That's an incredibly high hurdle for one, ghetto rat kid that I used to be, with an associate's degree to climb. And it's unfair to have to climb it. I should be able to achieve the level of success that I deserve. And that's true of every other white male that I know. I mean, I know quite a few white male poets, and I almost think that there isn't a single one of them that is getting the credit they deserve. There might be a couple, and they're usually legacy writers. They're usually people who are far in advance of the curve, of the diversity curve. And so again, if you don't want a Donald Trump, you don't make the conditions possible for Donald Trump. If you do this diversity garbage, and you exclude large numbers of people, which would include lately Asian people now. I mean, I don't even see why Asian people would vote for Democrats at this point. They've actively tried to sabotage Asians from achieving the success that they deserve, by keeping them out of Harvard for some reason, because they're like honorary whites, and white's a slur in this weird world that we've come into, where somehow just by being white, that automatically means that you've had some life that is an easy life. I can tell you, there is no such thing as an easy life. First of all, this is one of the great ironies of the whole idea, is that there are lives that are harder than other lives. I don't think that's true at all. I think maybe the hardest kind of life there is these days. Not in the past now, but in these days, in these recent days, in the last couple of decades, one of the hardest things to be is a white male. Because everybody hates you. They hate you. The default is that you have been given every advantage in life. And if you fail, then you're just a bum. You're a loser. You're a nobody. I mean, I felt this when I was struggling, when I was homeless. Nobody cared about me. Nobody felt pity for me. To this day, they don't feel pity for me. Now, I'm going to have a video at some point here where I talk about how I've never been able to be vulnerable. It's very hard for me to be vulnerable because I grew up in a hard situation, and in order to survive, you have to close off to some degree. You have to say, I'm going to put my nose to the grindstone, and I'm going to keep going forward, because if you don't do that, nobody's going to pick you up. No, it's not true. I've gotten a lot of help along the way, but that's the way you feel. But I've always felt as if the wind is in my face. John Scalzi, a guy who I've had a lot of problems with in the past, once said that white guys are playing on the lowest possible difficulty level, and everybody else is playing in a harder difficulty level. I think he has it exactly wrong. I think a white guy like him, who was given every financial and parental advantage, yeah, maybe for him he was playing on the lowest possible difficulty level. But if you're not coming from that advantage, if you're a white guy who's struggling in any way, shape, or form, if you're a white guy who comes from the ghetto like I did, or you come from Appalachia, or you went in the service and you have PTSD and now you're really struggling, if you have depression or anything else, the idea that there's a reason why white men kill themselves more than anybody else. It's not an accident. I mean, women are starting to catch up a little bit, but white men, more than anybody, swallow the bullet. You think of Hemingway, you think of Brodigan, you think of all these people, Kurt Cobain. The list is almost endless of white guys who have just done themselves in, even though they've been immensely successful in life. And part of it is because, so much is expected of them, and so little quarter is given to them. And ultimately, that comes out both in personal tragedies, I'm talking about, but it also comes out politically. It comes out as ultimately people become very, very disenchanted with the way of the world. And Donald Trump is an example of that. Donald Trump is not a rejection of the Democrats, and he's a rejection of everything about elitist culture. Everything. He's a rejection of Hollywood. He's a rejection of the academic institutions of this country. He's a rejection of the Republicans and the way they view people as mere economic pawns. He's a rejection of Democrats and the way they look at people in terms of balkanized groups. He's a rejection of, going down the street and getting a dirty look because you're a white guy. You're a woman who is not, completely in line with feminism, or you're a black conservative, or a black Christian, or a black woman who wants to have school vouchers for her ghetto child so that they can get a real education rather than that crap thing they're getting at their own school. Or if you're anybody who doesn't sign on to the whole leftist line and is called a racist and a bigot and a homophobe and a deplorable, and my personal favorite, irredeemable. Hillary Clinton said that about people, that they were irredeemable. Now think about that. Now she's a Methodist, okay? Christ didn't think the worst of the worst were irredeemable. All right? Child molesters are not irredeemable in Christianity. Murderers, serial killers are not irredeemable. But this woman went on national TV in a major speech and called people who disagreed with her politically, at least 25% of the population, irredeemable. There was nothing they could do to redeem themselves. Think about the mentality of that. Think about how that kind of, and the whole speech was about diversity. It was because she goes into the laundry list, Islamophobia, you know how she talks in that scornful way, in that schoolmarm way, the smarmy, sarcastic, snide, bitter voice of hers. Islamophobia, homophobia, the whole thing, they're all deplorable. It's all a diversity thing. Everybody against them. And ultimately, them said enough. Them said, that's it, enough. we want Donald Trump. Flaws and all, we'll take him because he's not going to, instigate race riots as Obama often did. And he's not going to balkanize us in this way. And he's not going to look down on us just because we have a different way of living. And ultimately, that's the cost of diversity. The cost of diversity is that in the end, it does exactly the opposite of what it says it's intending to do. It causes us to split apart into groups and to hate each other. It makes us less diverse. It makes us less tolerant and less accepting of each other. And that's why it has to be fought against. Not just by people on the right, but by anybody who wants good things to happen to our country and to the world. And I want to say this about diversity as well. I don't think that the left really likes diversity. I mean true diversity. I mean the kind of diversity where France is France, and Germany is Germany, and Russia is Russia, and China is China, and South America is South America, or South Africa is South Africa, and Brazil is Brazil. And each country is its own country, and each place is its own place, and they have their own tradition, cultures, and values. And they hold those things dear. And they, and maybe there's travel, but there's not, there's not large upsetting of those traditions, cultures, and values. When you look at how they even changed Superman's famous line, truth, justice, and the American way, to truth, justice, and all that other stuff. As if there's something wrong with the American way. Well, the American people said in 2016, there's nothing wrong with the American way. We like the American way. It's good. America First is not a racist or homophobic or bigoted way of looking at the world. It's a way of saying we like ourselves. We're good. And I believe that. I believe that America is a great place, full of great people, of all different kinds of people. But those distinct values, those foundational values that we have, those are who we are. And you can't, like Obama, want to change them without changing us in a way that many of us are not going to accept. Because it doesn't work. It might work somewhere else. It might work in Norway. It might work in Sweden. Now I'm having my doubts about that as well. But it's not going to work here. And if it's not going to work here, then all you're doing is setting yourself up for failure by forcing people to be something they don't want to be. That is the very essence of tyranny. And that's why this whole diversity cult, this whole diversity line, has been nothing but a tyrannical will to power where people have chosen to step on the heads of innocent other people in order to advance their own cause. And it sucks. And that's all I have to say about that. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and share this video. And thanks for listening, and God bless.